Thank you for joining me today for this Crash Course Series episode of Down syndrome. Oh, here we go. We got some more people coming in. So whether you are currently caring for someone with Down syndrome, if you know someone with Down syndrome, if you're a professional that works with someone with Down syndrome, or you're just curious, I'm glad that you joined me today for this installment of our Crash Course series. So for those of you who have not participated, basically the Crash Course series is just my way of giving everyone a base understanding of some of our most common diagnoses of the caregivers on our program. I know this might be a review for some of you, this might be brand new information for some of you, but hopefully it's useful information. And I'm not a professional, medical professional or anything like that, but I am a pretty decent researcher, and I hope the information that I've curated for you today at least gives you a better baseline understanding of Down syndrome. And as I've said before in previous trainings, that I think education is our best tool to grow and cultivate compassion for others. The better we understand others, the better we are equipped to just be kind and understanding and all the fun things that we love as part of being a human being. So please put your email in the chat if you have yet to do so, so I can send the post survey just to get your feedback on the training and if the information was useful to you or not. So I'll go ahead and share my screen again and get started, and anybody who's joining us later, they can just play catch up with us. Let's see. And pull my PowerPoint up instead of my emails. There we go. All right, a few more people joining in. All right. So today we're going to, of course, talk about Down syndrome. And we're going to address first and foremost preferred language. I think it's important to know what the current terms are, and what's appropriate, what's not appropriate to speak or to say when speaking about or to someone who has Down syndrome. So we're going to go over that first and foremost. And then we're going to talk about what is Down syndrome. We're going to define it. I think it's one of those diagnoses that we probably have some information about, but maybe unless you're in the world, you don't know as much as those who are. And so this will be a great opportunity for you to pick up some new information. Then we're going to talk about the causes and risk factors to a Down syndrome diagnosis. We're going to talk about some of the symptoms, how is it diagnosed, and then we're going to touch briefly on treatments and complications that can arise with the Down syndrome diagnosis. And then we're going to spend a good portion of time busting some myths, because I think with all of these diagnoses that I've gone over, there's a lot of information circulating about them. And some of it is really, really good information, and some of it is very unhelpful misinformation. And so I like to do the myth busting just to kind of bring some of those myths and some of those ideas and some of those understandings to light and get the right accurate information. And then after that, we're going to highlight some trailblazers. Those are people who are diagnosed with Down syndrome, but they're living full, healthy, lives and really making a difference in their community. And I think it's important to highlight the abilities of people with disabilities, okay? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's go ahead and get into it. I do have a lot of information to go over. So if it's a lot and you want some more details or you want the information afterwards, please let me know, and I'll be more than happy to share the information I have with you and my sources as well, so you can do your own research. So here we go. First and foremost, preferred language. Words matter, right? And how we speak sets the tone for how we interact with families and individuals with Down syndrome. And so taking extra time and care to describe people with Down syndrome properly and addressing them properly is something that families and people with Down syndrome really appreciate, as it shows respect for the individual. So whenever we're talking about someone with any type of diagnoses, but Down syndrome in particular, we want to use person-first language. And really all that means is instead of introducing or leading with the diagnoses, we lead with the person. Okay, so that would sound sorry, I lost my train of thought. That would sound like instead of saying a Down syndrome child, you would say a child with Down syndrome. See, so instead of putting Down syndrome first and then child second, we're referring to them as the person first, okay? And so you can think of, anybody who maybe has an autism diagnosis. You don't want to say, oh, there's an autistic person over there, right? You would say that person has autism, or a person living with autism, okay? Same thing with Down syndrome. It's a person first, okay? So instead of saying a Down syndrome child, it should be a child with Down syndrome. Also avoid Downs with the apostrophe S, Downs child, and describing the condition as Downs as in he has Downs, okay? Next, we need to understand that Down syndrome is a condition or a syndrome. It is not a disease, okay? And people have Down syndrome. They do not suffer from it, and they are not afflicted by it, okay? It's important to know that even though there are some complications and maybe some new tools that we need to learn if we have Down syndrome or we're taking care of someone who does have Down syndrome, doesn't necessarily mean that they are worthy of pity or anything like that. So, a lot of people who have Down syndrome are very happy and they have very fulfilling lives. And so to say that they're suffering from it or afflicted by it, it's not a good look. Okay, so we don't want to say that. Next, we use terms like typically developing or typical. That's preferred over normal. So you don't want to say, well, my child is normal or compared to normal children. Okay, we say typical or typically developing. Okay, because there's, even though it's not, not everybody has Down syndrome. Okay, that doesn't make them abnormal or, bizarre or anything like that. Okay, so we want to just make sure we use the proper language. Also, intellectual disability or cognitive disability has replaced mental retardation as the appropriate term. If any of you are familiar, generations ago, decades ago, they used to use the term mental retardation to describe anyone who has a cognitive or intellectual disability. And that term is not used anymore. It's outdated. Oh, here we go, is another person. And in that vein, and this will be the only time you hear me say the R word, is for educational purposes only. So we want to make it very clear that the National Down Syndrome Society, as well as Alabama Lifespan Respite, strongly condemn the use of the word retarded in any derogatory context. Using this word is hurtful and suggests that people with disabilities are not competent. And so even though medically it used to be, labeled as mental retardation, it has, over the course of time, has degraded into a slur. And so anytime you use that word in reference to somebody with intellectual or cognitive disabilities, it is perceived as a slur. So just be aware of that. If that's something that you've used in the past, here is your invitation to use more accurate and updated terms, okay? And then finally on this slide, we've got Down versus Downs. So the preferred spelling is Down syndrome rather than Downs with the apostrophe S. So Down syndrome is named for the English physician John Langdon Down, and he characterized the condition but did not have the condition. So if we use the apostrophe S, we're connotating possession, and so, or ownership or possession. And so we don't use Downs anymore. It may still be listed in many dictionaries with both the popular spellings with or without the apostrophe S, but the preferred usage in the United States is Down syndrome with no S, okay? So now that we got that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into what is Down syndrome. Every cell in the human body, there is a nucleus where genetic material is stored in genes. And genes carry the codes responsible for all of our inherited traits and are grouped among rod-like structures called chromosomes. Typically, the nucleus of each cell will contain 23 pairs of chromosomes, half of which are inherited from each parent. And Down syndrome occurs when an individual has a full or partial copy of the chromosome 21. The additional genetic material will alter the course of development and cause the characteristics associated with Down syndrome, okay? So Down syndrome is a chromosomal diagnosis, okay? So there's 3 types of Down syndrome. There's I'm not sure if it's trisomy or trisomy. You're going to hear me mispronounce a lot of words today, so please, I ask for your grace. But trisomy 21 or non-disjunction is the most common cause for Down syndrome. So it's usually caused by an error in cell division called non-disjunction. And that results in an embryo with 3 copies of chromosome 21 instead of the usual 2. So prior to or at conception, a pair of 21st chromosomes in either the sperm or the egg fails to separate. And as the embryo develops, the extra chromosome is replicated in every cell of the body. And this type of Down syndrome accounts for 95% of all cases. So the majority of people who have Down syndrome diagnosis have the trisomy 21 diagnosis. The other 2 are not as common, but I think they're worth noting. There's mosaicism or mosaic Down syndrome, and that is diagnosed when there's a mixture of 2 cell types, some containing the usual 46 chromosomes and some containing 47. So the cells with 47 chromosomes will contain the or extra chromosome 21. And that is mosaicism is the least common form of Down syndrome, and it accounts for only about 2% of all cases. But research has indicated that individuals with mosaic Down syndrome may have fewer characteristics of Down syndrome than those with other types. So I actually read a story while I was doing research here of a young woman who I think she had 2 or 3 children and they were all diagnosed with Down syndrome, and come to find out she was actually had mosaic Down syndrome and didn't know because she didn't have some of the common traits that you would expect to see with someone with the diagnoses. And so that's one, it's more rare and it's least likely to be diagnosed because it doesn't have some of the telltale symptoms or signs. But of course, we can't make broad generalizations because there's such a wide range of abilities with people with Down syndrome. So it's, we try not to make big blanketed terms, but typically they won't have the, like I said, the telltale signs. And then finally, we've got translocation. So in translocation, that accounts for about 3% of Down syndrome diagnoses. So it's a little more common than mosaicism, but it's not as. And so the total number of chromosomes in the cell still remains 46. However, an additional full or partial copy of chromosome 21 attaches to another chromosome, usually chromosome 14. And the presence of an extra full or partial chromosome 21 causes the characteristics of Down syndrome. So regardless of the type of Down syndrome a person may have, all people with Down syndrome have an extra critical portion of chromosome 21 present in all or some of their cells. So the cause for the extra full or partial chromosome is still unknown. Age is the only factor that's been linked to an increased chance of having a baby with Down syndrome. However, due to higher birth rates, younger women, the higher birth rates in younger women, 51% of children with Down syndrome are born to women under the age of 35. So even though advanced maternal age has been linked to a factor in Down syndrome, just simple statistics, because more women under 35 have children than women over 35, more people with Down syndrome are born to women who are under the age of 35. There is no definitive scientific research that indicates that Down syndrome is caused by any environmental factors or the parents' activities before or during pregnancy. The additional partial or full copy of the 21st chromosome, which causes Down syndrome, can originate from either parent. But approximately 5% of the cases have been traced to the father. So that's my little 6th grade biology lesson for you today. Maybe you learned something new, maybe you didn't. But we're going to go ahead and move on to how common is Down syndrome and when was it discovered. So according to the CDC, or the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, approximately 1 in every 772 babies in the United States is born with Down syndrome. And that makes Down syndrome the most common chromosomal condition. About 5,000 babies with Down syndrome are born in the United States each year. So in the late 19th century, John Langdon Down, an English physician, published an accurate description of a person with Down syndrome. It was this scholarly work published in 1866 that earned Down the recognition as the quote-unquote father of the syndrome. So although other people had previously recognized the characteristics of the syndrome, it was Down who described the condition as a distinct and separate identity. So that's where we come up with the name Down syndrome, is because of John Langdon Down, the man who first wrote the scholarly article about the characteristics and the diagnoses, okay? So we kind of touched over this a little bit in my last slide, but we're going to get in a little bit more deeply. The causes and risk factors of Down syndrome. So there is no known behavioral or environmental factors that cause Down syndrome. What that means, it's nothing that the parents do or don't do. It's nothing that the environment has or does not have that causes Down syndrome, at least that we know of so far, okay? So I know a lot of times I've spoken with mothers who have a diagnosis of some kind with their child. And of course, I think we're just hardwired to feel guilty sometimes, even if it's not appropriate for us to feel guilt. And so if you are one of those people and you're feeling some sort of guilt or concern that maybe this was your fault, there's nothing in the evidence that says that this is caused by any particular behavior or environmental factor, okay? Most of the time, Down syndrome is not inherited. It's caused by an error in cell division during early development of the fetus, okay? Some parents have a higher risk of having a baby with Down syndrome. So some of the risk factors include advanced maternal age, so over the age of 35, being carriers of the genetic translocation for Down syndrome, or having one child with Down syndrome. So if you have one child with Down syndrome, you're more likely to have another one with Down syndrome. So translocation Down syndrome can be passed from parent to child. However, only about 3 to 4% of children with Down syndrome have translocation, and only some of them inherit it from some other parents. So even inherited Down syndrome is not as common as non-inherited Down syndrome. Let's see, so I'm going through, see, I got a lot of notes, but I'm trying to kind of pare it down to what's actually relevant to what you would need to know. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about advanced maternal age. So a woman's chance of giving birth to a child with Down syndrome increases with age because older eggs have a greater risk of improper chromosome division. And I'm sure most of you know a woman is born with all the eggs she will ever have. And so if she's 35 years old, that means her eggs are 35 years old. Okay, it doesn't mean that the woman herself is old. It just means that her eggs are older than, because, she was born with them. So they're going to be the same age as she is. Being carriers of the genetic translocation for Down syndrome, both men and women can pass that down. So it's not just about the maternal side, it's also about the paternal side as well. Next, we're going to talk about symptoms. So each person with Down syndrome is an individual. So we want to remind ourselves of that, okay? We can't assume everything is going to be applicable to every person, okay? But these are some of the common symptoms that we see as, when Down syndrome manifests into a baby. This is what we see. So intellectual and developmental problems may be mild, moderate, or severe. Some people are healthy, but others have significant health problems, such as serious heart defects. So children and adults with Down syndrome have distinct facial features, though not all people with Down syndrome have the same features. So some of the more common features are a flattened face, smaller neck, or smaller head, excuse me, shorter neck, a protruding tongue, upward slanting eyelids, also called palpebral fissures. Again, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that word. Unusually shaped or small ears, poor muscle tone, broad, short hands with a single crease in the palm, relatively short fingers and small hands and feet, excessively flexible, tiny white spots in the iris of the eyes called brushfield spots, shorter height, and infants with Down syndrome may be average size, but typically they grow slowly and will remain shorter than their peers, and intellectual disabilities, okay? So again, these are not going to be in everybody, and they're going to be in varying degrees as well, okay? But these are just some of the more common features that we see. So now we're going to talk about how Down syndrome is diagnosed. So you can either get diagnosis prenatally, so that's while the mother is still carrying the baby, or after the baby is born at birth. Okay, so there's two categories of tests for Down syndrome that can be performed before a baby is born, screening tests and diagnostic tests. So prenatal screens estimate the chances of a baby having Down syndrome, but they are not going to tell you for sure whether they have Down syndrome. They can only provide a probability. So diagnostic tests, on the other hand, can provide definitive diagnosis with almost 100% accuracy. So we're going to go over those here in more detail. So there is an extensive menu of prenatal tests that are available for pregnant parents. And if you've recently had a child, at least within the last 10 years or sooner, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They're always offering you some sort of test or screen or something. And it just seems like this gets more and more every year. So most screening tests involve a blood test and an ultrasound, also known as a sonogram. Blood tests are also known as serum screening tests. They measure quantities of various substances in the blood of the parent. So they factor that in together with the age that's used to estimate the chance of a child having Down syndrome. Blood tests are often performed in conjunction with a detailed ultrasound to check for markers, quote unquote. These are characteristics that some researchers feel may have a significant association with Down syndrome. But new advanced prenatal screens are now able to detect chromosomal material from the fetus that is circulating in the maternal blood. So they're becoming more and more adept at catching the chromosomal differences just by screening the blood of the mother, which I think is fascinating. And those are not very invasive tests, but they provide a high accuracy rate. But still, all these screens will not definitively diagnose Down syndrome. Prenatal screening and diagnostic tests are now routinely offered to women of all ages, just because we don't know, right? So we just screen everybody. So there's, let's see here. There are amniocentesis is usually performed in the second trimester between 15 and 20 weeks of gestation. And the, sorry, I'm gonna say it all goofy, chorionic villus sampling, or CVS, is usually in the first trimester between 11 and 14 weeks, okay? So they carry, unfortunately, a lot of times people will reject the screenings, the prenatal screenings, because they do have a pretty low risk, about 1%, but they do have a low risk of miscarriage. And that they are usually about 100% accurate in diagnosing Down syndrome, but because of the risk, there are a lot of women who choose to reject the screening, which is understandable. But even though it is a low risk, it is still a risk, and it's of course everyone's right to choose to get that screening or not. And so now at birth, Down syndrome is usually identified at birth by the presence of certain physical traits. Low muscle tone, a single deep crease across the palm of the hand, a slightly flattened facial profile, and an upward slant to the eyes. So these features may be present in babies without Down syndrome. A chromosomal analysis called a karyotype is done to confirm the diagnosis. So after the baby's born, if the doctor and the nurses do like a physical assessment and they say maybe we should screen this child, they will go ahead and do the karyotype analysis. So to obtain that karyotype, the doctors draw a blood sample to examine the baby's cells. They photograph the chromosomes and group them by size, number, and shape. And by examining the karyotype, the doctors can diagnose Down syndrome. There is another genetic test called fluorescence in situ hybridization, or FISH for short, and that can confirm a diagnosis in a short amount of time by visualizing and mapping genetic material in an individual's cells. So this, I think, is fascinating how far we've come just in our, our medical capacity to really screen and get a 100% definitive diagnosis without hurting the child. I think that's amazing. Okay, and now we're going to move on to treatments and complications. So many of associated conditions may require immediate care right after birth, occasional treatment throughout childhood and adolescence, or long-term treatment throughout life. So again, you're seeing this as a spectrum, okay? For example, an infant with Down syndrome might need surgery a few days after birth to correct heart defects, or a person with Down syndrome may have digestive problems that require a lifelong special diet. So it's really about the individual. So there's no single standard treatment for Down syndrome. Treatments are usually based on an individual's physical and intellectual needs, as well as their personal strengths and limitations. People with Down syndrome can receive proper care while living at home in the community. Okay, so we don't need special facilities. We don't need, there's no pill for Down syndrome, right? There's no shot for Down syndrome. The treatments are often going to be about co-occurring issues with Down syndrome, so heart defects, things like that. And we'll go over those here in a minute. So a child with Down syndrome likely will receive care from a team of health professionals. That could include, but not limited to, physicians, special educators, speech therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and social workers. All professionals who interact with children with Down syndrome should provide stimulation and encouragement. People with Down syndrome are at a greater risk for a number of health problems and conditions than are people who do not have Down syndrome. So again, the treatments and complications aren't Down syndrome specific. It's some of these other complications that may arise because of the Down syndrome diagnoses. So what are those complications? Well, they can include heart defects, gastrointestinal defects, immune disorders, sleep apnea, obesity, spinal problems, leukemia, and dementia. So let's go into these a little bit more in detail. So heart defects, about half the children with Down syndrome are born with some type of congenital heart defect. These heart problems can be life-threatening and may require surgery in early infancies. GI defects, those abnormalities occur in some children with Down syndrome and may include abnormalities of the intestines, esophagus, and the trachea, and the anus. The risk of developing digestive problems such as a GI blockage, heartburn, or celiac disease also may be increased. Immune disorders. Because of abnormalities in the immune system, people with Down syndrome are at an increased risk of developing autoimmune disorders, some forms of cancer and infectious diseases such as pneumonia. And sleep apnea, because of soft tissue and skeletal changes that lead to the obstruction of the airways, children and adults with Down syndrome are at a greater risk of obstructive sleep apnea. People with Down syndrome have a greater tendency to be obese compared to the general population. And some people with Down syndrome may have a misalignment of the top of the two vertebrae in the neck. And I'm going to go ahead and try to pronounce it. It's called atlantaxial instability. And this condition puts them at risk of serious injury to the spinal cord from overextension of the neck. The risk of leukemia in young children with Down syndrome, it's increased, the risk of leukemia. And dementia. People with Down syndrome have a greatly increased risk of dementia. Signs and symptoms may begin around the age of 50. So having Down syndrome also increases the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And I learned recently the reason why is because the genetic or the chromosome that they find that can cause dementia is the 21st chromosome. So that's why there's an increased risk for them. So other problems people with Down syndrome or that may be associated with Down syndrome include endocrine problems, dental problems, seizures, ear infections, and hearing and vision problems. So of course, people with Down syndrome need to get routine medical care in treating these issues and to help maintain a healthy lifestyle. So now we're going to get into the myths. Some of these I was aware of, some of them I weren't, and I was actually surprised at how cruel some of these were. And so I'll just get into them and you'll see what I'm talking about. So the first myth is most children with Down syndrome are born to older parents. We kind of touched over this already, but the truth is most children with Down syndrome are born to women younger than 35 years old simply because younger women have more children. However, the likelihood of having a child with Down syndrome increases with the age of the mother, especially after age 35. The next myth, adults with Down syndrome are the same as children with Down syndrome. That is absolutely not true. Just like, I don't know why, but our culture likes to infantilize people with disabilities. That means we talk to them like they're children. We use, kind of endearing words like sweetheart, honey, which, it's not done with malicious intent. But if you're an adult and people are always talking to you as if you're a child, it can kind of get on your nerves after a while. So we want to remember that adults with Down syndrome are not children and should not be considered children. They enjoy activities and companionship with other adults and have similar needs and feelings as their typical peers. Next, people with Down syndrome are always happy. The truth is, people with Down syndrome have feelings just like everybody else. Surprise, right? They experience the full range of emotions and they respond to positive expressions of friendship and are hurt and upset by inconsiderate behavior, just like everybody else. The next myth, all people with Down syndrome have a severe cognitive disability. Well, the truth is, people with Down syndrome have mild to moderate cognitive disabilities or intellectual disabilities, but that is not indicative of the many strengths and talents that each individual possesses. So be considerate of the extra time it might take a person who has a disability to get things done. But again, it's a spectrum. So some people may struggle more in this area than others, okay? Next, adults with Down syndrome are unable to form close interpersonal relationships. The truth is, people with Down syndrome socialize and have meaningful friendships. Some choose to date, maintain ongoing relationships, and marry. Next, people with Down syndrome are always sick. The truth is, people with Down syndrome are at an increased risk for certain medical conditions, such as congenital heart defects, respiratory, hearing problems, thyroid conditions, the things we just went over. But advances in healthcare and treatment of these conditions have allowed most individuals with Down syndrome to lead healthy lives. So there may be an increased risk of sickness or illness, but that doesn't mean that they're always sick or always ill, okay? There's all kinds of people who have autoimmune disorders and thyroid disorders that do not have Down syndrome, and we don't lump them into that category of always being sick either, right? So we give the same courtesy to our friends with Down syndrome. Next, people with Down syndrome cannot be active members of the community. The truth is, people with Down syndrome are active participants in educational, social, and recreational activities. They're included in the typical education system and take part in sports, music, art programs, and any other activity in the community. People with Down syndrome are valued members of their families and communities and make meaningful contributions to society. And we'll definitely highlight some of those contributions at the end of my presentation. Next, adults with Down syndrome are unemployable. Well, the truth is, businesses employ adults with Down syndrome for a variety of positions. Banks, corporations, hotels, hospitals, nursing homes, offices, restaurants, etc. They work in the music industry, the entertainment industry, clerical positions, childcare, sports fields, computer industries. So just like anybody else, people with Down syndrome want to have a job where their work will be valued, okay? Next, people who have Down syndrome don't feel pain. This one I was really surprised at, and maybe I'm just living under a rock or something, but I never heard this before, and I thought it was very strange, but we're going to debunk it right now. So people with Down syndrome absolutely feel pain. So the reaction to pain is not always apparent. For example, a 2000 study published in the medical journal Lancet suggests that such individuals express pain more slowly and less precisely, but it doesn't mean they don't experience pain, okay? So parents and guardians need to be firm with the medical community and insist that people with Down syndrome be given the same types of pain protocol and procedures as a typical person, even in the absence of obvious signs of pain, okay? So they aren't pain-free. It's just a different experience, okay? Different expression of pain. And next, babies who have Down syndrome are the result of incest. Well, we just went over the causes of incest, right? There's absolutely no relationship between incest and Down syndrome, okay? So we're going to debunk that right now. And this is my last Mythbusters page. A child with Down syndrome will ruin a marriage. A recent Vanderbilt Kennedy Center study published in the American Association of Intellectual Disabilities indicates that divorce rates are lower in families with children who have Down syndrome. The study was one of the largest to date and included 647 families who have children with Down syndrome. So again, this is why lived experience is so important when we teach this out in the community, because if you haven't had this experience, we can't just make these blanketed terms and believe them, okay? So people who have children with Down syndrome, have strong, loving relationships, just like people who have children that are typical, right? So it's always good to err on the side of caution and not make assumptions about people and their personal lives. Next, a child with Down syndrome negatively impacts their siblings. Well, the truth is, studies do not support that a child with Down syndrome will have a negative impact on siblings. A recent study published in the Journal of Intellectual Disability Research found no long-term detrimental effects to siblings. In fact, some mental health professionals point to the psychological advantages of a child or such a child in the care within the family circle. They've documented siblings who have increased tolerance, compassion, and awareness in contrast to all typical siblings. Okay, so it's not a negative impact. Studies show that it's actually a positive impact. Go figure. Next, people with Down syndrome all look alike. The truth is, many but not all people with Down syndrome do share common features. For example, many but not all people with Down syndrome have almond-shaped eyes and a short stature. However, just like typical people who share similar features, they look more like their families than they do look like each other. Okay. Next, people with Down syndrome can't go to regular schools. But the truth is, it is not only advisable that children with Down syndrome attend their public schools. In the US, it is required by law that public schools accept and provide an appropriate education to them. This requirement is outlined in the Individuals with Disability Education Act, also known as IDEA. And IDEA stipulates that all children with disabilities must have available to them a free, appropriate public education that meets their unique needs and prepares them for further education, employment, and independent living, just like their typical peers. Further studies show that including students with disabilities in the classroom improves the academic process of students without disabilities. So again, we're seeing that inclusivity, diversity, it's good for everybody, okay? So we need to keep people out of these little boxes and start integrating each other. And then finally, the myth, parents will not find community support in bringing up their child with Down syndrome. Well, the truth is, in almost every community in the United States, there are parent support groups and other community organizations directly involved in providing services to the family of individuals with Down syndrome. And you can find a list of these groups on the website ndss.org. Okay. So let's get to the fun part, the trailblazers. So this is where I'm probably going to completely butcher a lot of these names. I'm trying very hard to pronounce them properly, but if you know the proper pronunciation, please let me know. These are all global individuals, so some of their names are just not familiar to me, so that's why I can't pronounce them. But the first one we're going to talk about is Angela Bachelier, I'm not sure, sorry. But she is a politician who kicked off her political career in 2011. She began working at City Hall in the Spanish city of Valladolid. I'm so sorry. Valladolid. She's a member of the People's Party, and she spent over 2 years working as an administrative assistant in City Hall. And then she was standing for election in 2011. She did not win the seat in that election. She placed 18th out of 17 available spots. But she did end up assuming office 2 years later when there was a corruption scandal that forced somebody to resign. And so she took over their position. And so some people may attempt to downplay her success by pointing out that she didn't outright win the election, but we should also note that she very well may have if people with Down syndrome were allowed to vote in Spain. So there's no outright ban on people with intellectual disabilities voting, but Spanish courts usually will declare a person with Down syndrome as incapacitated with the intent to protect them from fraud and exploitation, but it also revokes their right to vote. So it's all the more impressive that she was able to hold a position when she couldn't even vote for herself. I think that's pretty impressive. Next, we're going to talk about Colette DeVito. She's an entrepreneur. So even without laws that explicitly forbid people with Down syndrome from fully integrating into society, people with Down syndrome consistently face an uphill battle in trying to do so. And so Colette DeVito discovered just how true this is when, despite finishing a 3-year cooking course at Clemson University in just 2 years, job interview after job interview, she was met with nothing but polite rejection. She was determined to enter the workforce, and so Colette took her most popular recipe, the amazing cookie, and founded Colette's Cookies. Initially working with a single grocery store, Collette gradually built up her client base, raising her profile with media appearances on CNN, MSNBC, CBS, GMA, BBC, and more, ultimately leading to a partnership with Lay's Potato Chips. So now she employs 13 people and hopes to use her platform to reduce unemployment and poverty levels among people with disabilities. Next, we have Jamie Brewer. She's an actress that many of you may recognize from prominent and recurring roles on American Horror Story series. If you like spooky stuff and you've watched that show, you probably recognize her face. She worked in theater for over a decade, but skyrocketed to international fame when she made her TV debut portraying Adelaide Langdon on the pilot of the hit horror show, and has been a regular fixture ever since. In an interview conducted shortly after season one aired, Brewer said that the most difficult part of playing Adelaide was learning how to portray someone who isn't always viewed acceptable to her mother in society. This is a new challenge for me. So she obviously had a very supportive family growing up, and having to pretend and be in a character of somebody who didn't was different for her. So since she started on the show, she has worked on a number of TV shows and films and is currently slated to play Princess Aurora, aka Sleeping Beauty, in a film series that takes old fairy tales and gives a more active role to the leading ladies, which I think that's amazing. Next, we have Marte Wexelsen Goxior. She's a playwright. She's born in Norway in 1982. She's a public speaker and a disability activist, but is most well known for her work as a writer, more specifically a playwright. Her most famous work is her interpretation of Cinderella, which is based on her own life, and it was performed at one of Oslo's most prestigious theaters. Her work made her the first woman to win the Bjornson Prize from the Norwegian Academy of Literature and Freedom of Expression, and her version of Cinderella was even used as the basis of a scientific study that examined the differences in attitudes towards actors with disabilities. Next, we have Pablo Pineda. He is an actor and educator, most well known for being the first European with Down syndrome to obtain a university degree, having completed both a diploma in teaching and a BA in educational psychology. In 2009, he won the Silver Shell Award at the San Sebastian International Film Festival for his role in Yo Tambien, a film about a university graduate with Down syndrome. But despite the name, the Silver Shell Award is actually the top acting prize at the festival, which is one of only 14 Category A film festivals in the world, so that's a big deal. Upon returning to his native Malaga, Pineda was also presented with the Shield of the City by the local mayor. So he does still act, but he wants to build a career in education and is currently working on implementing an international strategy to increase employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Pineda is a regular guest speaker at universities across the world. He's written multiple books and has a TED Talk available to watch online. So you can kind of see how this activism thread is kind of woven through all of their careers, and I think that's beautiful. Next, we have Sujit Desai. He is a musician from Buffalo, New York, and he graduated high school with a 4.3 GPA before graduating from Berkshire Hills Music Academy 2 years later. All in all, he can play 7 instruments: piano, violin, drums, B sharp clarinet, I think, or B flat clarinet, the B clarinet. He can play the bass clarinet, the trumpet, and the saxophone. 2 documentaries have been made about his accomplishments, and he's received major media attention throughout the years, featuring on shows such as The View, 2020, Oprah Winfrey Show, as well as the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. His greatest accomplishment so far was his 2015 performance at Carnegie Hall, for which he received a standing ovation. So needless to say, Desai has a pantheon of awards to his name, including a number of Olympic medals. That, along with his musical ability, may be why he was chosen to give a solo performance at the opening ceremony of the 2009 Winter Special Olympics. And currently, he lives with his wife, Carolyn, in New York, and is working towards earning a second performance at Carnegie Hall. And finally, we have Madeline Stewart, who's a professional supermodel who was born in Australia in 1996. I don't know if anyone else just felt really old after I said that, but I do. 1996 doesn't seem that long ago to me. But after attending a Brisbane fashion show in 2014, Stewart decided that she wanted to be a model and began training. The following year, her mother launched an online campaign, which quickly gathered steam, resulted in Stewart signing 2 contracts in 1 week. Stewart's career includes quite the collection of accolades, including walking the catwalk at New York Fashion Week, Paris Fashion Week, London Fashion Week, various other weeks and shows around the world. Stewart has also been profiled in both Vogue and Forbes and has completed Special Olympics triathlon 3 times. Next, we've got Karen Gaffney, who's an athlete. She was the first person with Down syndrome to complete the English Channel relay race. But even then, her career was just getting started. She crossed the channel. She's also conquered Boston Harbor, San Francisco Bay 16 times and counting, Lake Champlain, Dune, Lougher Harbor, and the Escape from Alcatraz triathlon. In 2007, she was the focus of the documentary Crossing Tahoe, A Swimmer's Dream, and she's also the president of the Karen Gaffney Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization headquartered in Portland, Oregon, and they are dedicated to championing the journey to full inclusion for people with Down syndrome and other disabilities. And then finally, we have Isabella Springmole Tejada. Hopefully I said that right. And she followed in the footsteps of her grandmother, who was also a fashion designer. As a child, Isabella would create clothes for her dolls, but play eventually turned to work when she enrolled in a fashion course where she began working on clothes inspired by Guatemalan culture, as well as designs aimed specifically for people with Down syndrome. She had her first big showcase in 2015, where she sold her complete collection. The success of her show garnered international attention, and a second exhibit was quickly set up in Panama. Her momentum continued to build, and in 2016, her designs were shown in London Fashion Week, which was followed by another exhibit in Rome. All of this landed her a spot in the BBC's 100 Women list, an annual collection of the most inspirational and influential women in the world, alongside the likes of Alicia Keys, Simone Biles, and Zuleika Mandela. So I hope you can see here, and these are just few examples, that a Down syndrome diagnosis is not as limiting as maybe our culture would like to believe it to be. A lot of these people are very accomplished, way more accomplished than I'll ever be, just in the 9 that I presented to you, and there's many, many more. And so hopefully this gives you a fuller picture, a truer picture of people who have this diagnosis. So that's the information I have for you today. I'm more than happy to share my sources with you if you want to do some more of your research. Of course, here they are right here. If you want that printed out or sent to you in an email, let me know and I will do so. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing. And we do have some time for questions, reflections, comments, insights, anything that you all have on your mind that you want to share in reference to the information I shared with you today. All right. And while you all are thinking, I just want to remind you to please put your email in the chat so that I can send you a post survey and get your feedback. And I know I'm fully aware that not everybody that joined me today is caring for a person with Down syndrome, but I do hope that the information was useful, at least in some way, if nothing else, of just broadening your understanding of other people in our community, and kind of demystifying and debunking some of these ideas that we maybe have about people that maybe we don't interact with every day. You're welcome, Crystal. All right, so if there's nothing else to be said or done, I'll go ahead and end the meeting for today. I appreciate all of you all for showing up and joining us. I do want to let you know about what's coming down the pipeline before I let you go. So we've got June with CRS, Children's Rehabilitation Service, on the 16th, coming to share with us about the resources that they have available. So please register for that. And CRS is statewide, so you don't have to be in Huntsville to get to be able to use the information. And then on the 23rd, I'm going to be starting an Empowered Caregiver series, beginning with setting boundaries. And then on the 27th, I'm going to wrap up my crash course series with ADHD. So I hope you will join me for all or some of those. And of course, I always appreciate your feedback. Any type of suggestions on topics are more than welcome. So please send me an email. And if you're interested in doing a care chat, if you need some soft support from me, you can also reach out to me through email or call, and I can set one up for you there as well. All right. So thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of your week. And hopefully I'll see you guys in a couple days. Bye, everyone.